All right, let's jump into some of these autoimmune diseases associated with Chapter 6. Obviously, we can't go through every autoimmune disorder known to man, but we're just going to cover a few. One of the first ones we want to talk about then is asthma. It's a very common disorder that you're going to see a lot, so we need to understand the pathophysiology of why that occurs. Just a little bit of a tidbit here. Asthma comes from the Greek word for panting, which makes sense because it's a chronic inflammation of the airway. People can have asthma exacerbations or asthma attacks, and we know that these are usually triggered by something in the environment, and that makes the immune cells generate inflammation in the lungs, which can then make them even narrower, and this can be life-threatening. We want to talk about the molecular pathways that lead to asthma because they're fairly complex, but we'll try to keep it as simple as we can. First, we have to understand that the event is often initiated by an environmental trigger. So in asthma, there's often an excess reaction from type 2 helper cells, or Th2 cells, against these allergens. So our body takes in the allergen, and we get these Th2 cells become overreactive and overdo their job in an incorrect way. These Th2 cells then are known to be involved in asthma, and also atopic dermatitis and allergic rhinitis. And this is what's called the atopic triad. This is a concept that you may see like on future board kind of questions, because this is a very common triad to see together, and those are caused by the Th2 cells overreaction. What can happen then with asthma is that these allergens from the environment, think like cigarette smoke, are picked up by our dendritic cells, which present them to the Th2 cell. The Th2 cell then produces cytokines like IL-4 and IL-5, and then that cascade happens and we get these features of asthma. The example, IL-4, leads to the production of Ig antibodies. So we could say that if someone's exposed to cigarette smoke, it gets picked up by the dendritic cell. The dendritic cell presents it to Th2. Th2 then produces IL-4. IL-4 then leads to the production of IgE antibodies. Those IgE antibodies then coat the mast cells, and they stimulate them to then release their granules. And the mast cell granules contain histamine, leukotrienes, and prostaglandins. Okay? On the other hand, we could say it that we get an environmental trigger like cigarette smoke. Our dendritic cells pick them up. They are presented to the Th2 cell, and that then produces IL-5. When IL-5 is produced, IL-5 activates eosinophils, which promote an immune response by releasing more cytokines and leukotrienes. So if we were to think about asthma, and what happens is that the Th2 cells become activated, and we get activation of IgE and activation of eosinophils. Oftentimes, if you are caring for someone with acute asthma reactions, if you were to check a complete blood count, a CBC, would we be surprised if they had high numbers of eosinophils or eosinophilia? No, because we understand that we're in this autoimmune response, and our eosinophils have been activated. So in the case of asthma, since the IgE antibodies are being produced, this is an example of the type 1 hypersensitivity reaction. Now, two more events will happen. Early on, so like minutes after you're exposed to the allergen, your smooth muscle around the bronchioles will start to spasm, and there's this increased mucus secretion. And that also narrows the airways, so it makes it difficult to breathe. And that is why asthma is considered to be an obstructive pulmonary disease. So we often think about like tightening of the airways, but it actually also gets obstructed by an increased mucus production. There's also an increase in vascular permeability and recruitment of additional immune cells from the blood. Then a few hours after our exposure, these immune cells, particularly those eosinophils, will start to release their chemical mediators that also physically damage the endothelium of the lungs. Initially, these kind of changes are completely reversible, but over the years, especially with poorly controlled asthmatics, the changes become irreversible, and we start to see chronic edema, scarring, and fibrosis that's going to build up. And when it's built up, it thickens the epithelial basement membrane, and that will permanently reduce your ability to exchange gases because it reduces the airway diameter. So symptoms of asthma, think about coughing, feeling of tightness, dyspnea, difficulty breathing, wheezing, whistling. Occasionally in the sputum, you might see Kirschmann spirals. I'm not going to ask that question on the test. I just want you to hear that word. These are spiral-shaped mucus plugs that are elongated mucus casts that are formed from the small bronchi of people with bronchial asthma. So it's something that is specific to asthma. The mucus plugs, as we said, can be dangerous because they block the exchange of air, but they also block your inhaled medications from working. So that excess mucus production is very dangerous. The mucus may also contain the Charcot-Leyden crystals. And again, I'm not going to ask you that specifically, but if anybody ever asked you or you're reading something and you hear Kirschmann spirals or Charcot-Leyden crystals, we can think asthma. We will talk asthma later in your diagnosis and management courses, but this is just a brief overview of how we classify the asthma, and it can be very mild to moderate to life-threatening. Treatments include things like bronchodilators, steroids, beta agonists, leukotriene antagonists, etc. I'm not going to quiz you on that. I just wanted to kind of tie that in as you're thinking about asthma. And that's our wrap on asthma.